Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is Saturday morning in America, and it's Saturday afternoon in France, where I'm talking to Sophie Le Corre about William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. This is episode 8 in our ongoing series. I don't think we expected it to take this long, but hey, the text determines it. Sophie wanted to begin today's session with some discoveries she made from some Russian authors or philosophers that have been translated into French that she thought had bearing upon our discussion of the Blake poem. So I'm going to hand the mic over to her and let her explain just exactly what she discovered.
Yes, so this author is Paul Evdokimov, and I already talked about him in one of our previous episodes. And he was an Orthodox theologian and a philosopher who studied Dostoevsky, and he wrote a book called Dostoevsky and the Problem of Evil. And that's in this book that I read about Dostoevsky's short story, The Ridiculous Man, which I studied with Luke in another podcast. So I found the chapter in this book which talks about the problem of the fall, which is described by Dostoevsky in the short story The Ridiculous Man, The Dream of the Ridiculous Man. And so Evdokimov explains that good and evil, before they were differentiated, good was not good as it is now. So in the previous state of paradise, everything was harmony and uninterrupted growth outside of oppositions, past and future, good and less good. And the paradise, how can I say this in English? The being which was before the fall was different in his nature than the being after the fall. He was there was no evil in him. He was innocent, and everything was. He was orientated towards the infinite, and but what happened in Christian revelation, in the Christian story, yes, in the revelation, it describes how death and evil will disappear when God will be all in all. How do you say this in English? All in everyone. And
Well,
so,
that's a difficult.
yes,
I think you're doing a just fine job explaining it. That's fine. I
yes,
don't believe we have one word for that. I think there's probably a Greek word for that somewhere.
yes. And so man will come back to a state of integrity, in which there will not be any opposition and struggle. But there is another thing. The paradise of the ridiculous man doesn't make him joyful. We saw this. He felt nostalgia towards the fallen earth, and the problem is that his consciousness was already the consciousness of a man who has known sin. So as man has become of a different nature than he was before the fall, he can't come back to this state of paradise from which, because he has to change himself before. He cannot come back to it in the state in which he currently is. And so before the fall, he was in harmony with everything, he nourished himself from the tree of life, and he was living quite in conscious life. He understood the language of trees, animals, stars, cosmos, and so he was directed by his intuition, and he was absorbed by good. But after the fall, the goal of life became reintegrating this lost unity, and so the conscience of the awareness of personality was born from struggle and the knowledge of good and the opposition of two principles. And so man lost the unity of his inner world, and his self-consciousness was born in pain and struggle, and she was not she became the consciousness became how can I say this in English? It was controlled by the irrational subconscious, and also it suppressed the supraconscious, which is the road to God. And so man became afraid of his unconscious, and he tried to find a refuge in clear consciousness and rationality. And so he became afraid of intuition. So there, how do you say this word in English? There was a separation between thought and existence, which did not exist before. And knowledge, abstract and objective knowledge, abstract knowledge objectivize life and make it smaller, and man find himself rejected in a dislocated world. So consciousness became busy finding the laws of happiness, and work stopped having meaning. And so man became this was the beginning of objectivation, which I talked about before. So the separation of subject and object, even the opposition of subject and object, and so it's what we've already talked about, the objective knowledge. Man thought about life before he lived. How can I explain this? So the fall was becoming far from life and close to emptiness. Yes. How can I
Well, I think you're doing a good
explain this?
job. I wonder if we could tie this back into
Yes.
like what about this particular philosopher and what he's saying about his conception of the fall, how man got split up, and how there was this unity. How what about this made you think about the poem that we're currently discussing, the marriage of
I
heaven and
think,
hell?
yes, I think that's what Blake is talking about as well. I think he, with his criticism, his feeling of rebellion is rather against this objective knowledge, which separates man from the experience of life. And I think that's how I understood it. And so if I've read also about Berdyaev, the other one of the other philosophers we talked about. He talked about the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it's like William Blake would rather eat from the tree of life than the tree of knowledge.
That's interesting to keep in mind. At least biblically speaking, I believe the tree of life was something that granted immortality, and that's the reason why. If we're to get back to the Bible, in the episode where Adam and Eve eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, uh, they're cut off from the tree of life, so that in a sense, they truly wouldn't become godlike, that they would be mortal in a sense, and they would have to die. Is but I don't know so much about whether or not they were partaking in the tree of life, biblically speaking, and being nourished by it, as these philosophers intimate. That might be um, something that we can read between the lines, or part of a Talmudic tradition, an oral tradition, about how they were actually sustained at that time. But regardless, it's interesting to think about. And inevitably, these topics are going to the the way that reality works and fits together. I mean, a lot of what we're going to be covering today is a reaction to Swedenborg's third memorable relation. And we're going to get to the third memorable fancy, hopefully, by the end today. And we're given in that kind of a different conception of how things work on a spiritual plane versus how they're working on the terrestrial plane. And it may have everything to do with what Sophie just pointed out to us via these other philosophers. So I want to keep all of that in mind as we diagnose the poem. Are you ready to go jump back into the analysis of the poem, or did you want to say more about these philosophers that you came across this week?
I just wanted to add one last thing, which we talked about revelation, and it seems that the conception of Dostoevsky was that, and other thinkers thought that the destiny of man was to come back to a new state of innocence, but which would include his it would be a new unity, but which would include his experience of good and evil. So it will be the marriage of good and evil, which will give birth to this new state of unity.
It's an interesting way to think about it. You know, a lot of people, when they discuss the Odyssey, they go, "Oh, well, why did I mean, I'm just speculating out loud here. This is not some sort of doctrine that I believe or anyone else has to believe, but it's come up over the course of this conversation via these thoughts. You know, over the years, I've heard people go, "Oh, well, if God's so good, why did he even plant the knowledge of good and evil in the garden? And why did he allow the serpent to seduce Eve?" But if we look at it if we take a long term perspective, like you are suggesting here, where all of mankind is returned to uh, something like the original paradise, but it seems like the original paradise improved because you're going to have a situation where individuals actually experience sin consciousness where they did not have that experience before. So conceivably, all of human history, if we understand it this way, is still retains some sort of creative aspect where God is still molding humanity to ultimately get it to an even better condition than it was in paradise. It's like paradise plus, and it has to go through the fall and all these trials and tribulations to have even a superior understanding. And now, whether or not that's true or not, I don't know, but it seems to be this theme that we've toyed around with. I'm not at this stage. I don't know if that's an unbiblical understanding, but it is an intriguing one and a different answer to the theodicy questions than I think I've heard other people put out there.
Yes, that's how I understand what these thinkers were talking about.
Right. I mean, there's also, there's some troubling, implications of all of this too, right? Like, you have to posit in a way that like God, like we're told that God created everything in the beginning, and that that God is continually creating, and we have to ask ourselves, is that problematic with our Christian understanding of God? And this gets into big questions about predestination and all of that. But if this plan was set in motion at the very beginning of time, it's not really that he's continuing to create. It's just becoming obvious to us that this plan was set in motion then, and that these things were planted in order to make things happen. But then we get into some very interesting Calvinistic discussions about how much determinism there is within our realm. And that's a whole other discussion, but it's interesting. Shall we jump back into the poem?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we left off last time just talking just before the King David and this talk about the Jews code and before Ezekiel. Do you mind if I read where I think we left off?
Yes, go on.
Yeah, okay. It was this that our great poet King David desired so fervently and invoked so pathetically, saying by this he conquers enemies and governs kingdoms. And we so loved our God that we cursed in his name all the deities of surrounding nations and asserted that they had rebelled. For these opinions, the vulgar came to think that all nations would at last be subjected to the Jews. This, said he, like all firm persuasions, is come to pass, for all nations believe the Jews' code, worship the Jews' God, and what greater subjection can be? I heard this with some wonder, and must confess with my own conviction. After dinner, I asked Isaiah to favor the world with his lost works. He said none of equal value was lost. Ezekiel said the same of his. I also asked Isaiah what made him go naked and barefoot 3 years. He answered the same that made our friend Diogenes the Grecian. I then asked Ezekiel why he ate dung and lay so long on his right and left side. He answered the desire of raising other men into a perception of the infinite. This the North American tribes practice, and is he honest who resists his genius or conscience only for the sake of present ease or gratification? Okay. So it seems like what Blake is doing here, at least the interpretation that I got, is saying that Isaiah, Ezekiel, King David, essentially what they're trying to do is to get everybody to not be trapped in their idolatrous religions, but ultimately to be able to see the infinite in everything, and that this isn't the Jews' code, that this is a code that is available to everyone and in time becomes integrated into everybody, and they do all, air quotes, become Jews in that respect. What did you make of this thing about what Blake's talking about, the Jews' God, and why they were so interested in conquering um, other nations who worshipped false gods or deities.
Yes, it seems that it is about, like we talked about last time, the poetic genius, uh, because he says, uh, "Is he honest who resists his genius or conscience only for the sake of present ease or gratification?" I think that Blake is saying that these Jewish prophets were telling people that they should follow their genius, uh, even if it made their life difficult.
Yeah, he's taking some liberties here. I think I had to look up I had to go a little bit deeper into the Isaiah and to the Ezekiel thing. I knew about Ezekiel laying on his side, but I never really thought about it too much. But eating the dung and Isaiah going
Mm.
naked were interesting. I want to pull those up real quick. He's referring to Isaiah 23. And the Lord said, "Like as my servant Isaiah hath walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and wonder upon Egypt and Ethiopia." And so I was like, okay, that's weird. Isaiah's walking around naked. And I Matthew Henry's concise commentary says, the invasion and conquest of Egypt and Ethiopia, Isaiah was assigned to the people by his unusual dress. When he walked abroad, he commonly wore sackcloth as a prophet to show himself mortified to the world. He was to loose this from his loins, to wear no upper garments, and to go barefooted. This sign was to signify that the Egyptians and Ethiopians should be led away captives by the king of Assyria, thus stripped. So, and then he compares Isaiah to Diogenes. Okay, so what's going on with Diogenes? And this is from philosophybasics.com. Diogenes, born 412 BC, da 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 da, who was a rich money changer, is likely that he was exiled from Sinope for adulterating the coins his father minted with base metals, and made his way to Athens with a slave named Manus, who abandoned him shortly thereafter. He lived as a beggar in the streets of Athens, living semi-naked in a tub by the temple of Cybele, making a virtue of his extreme poverty. He's attracted by the ascetic teaching of Antisthenes, a student of Socrates. Diogenes became Antisthenes' pupil despite the brutality with which he was received, and rapidly surpassed both in reputation and in the austerity of his life. He avoided all earthly pleasures and openly disdained what he saw as the folly, pretense, vanity, social climbing, self-deception, and artificiality of much human conduct. So Blake is saying that Isaiah went naked the same reason why Diogenes did. Well, that doesn't seem to be entirely true. If we dig into it, Isaiah was not going bare chested or naked or whatever to practice some sort of austerity or something like that, but it was a sign to the Egyptians and Ethiopians, a very special circumstance. He hadn't embraced this sort of ascetic philosophy, whereas Diogenes is an ascetic. So now you could argue that ultimately the intentionality is the same, but I think Blake is playing a little fast and loose here with the analogy. What do you think?
The character of how do you say this?
Diogenes?
Diogenes. Mm-hmm. Yes, it made me think about an article I read recently about the hypersane, which is a psychological concept invented by Neil Burton. So I've just found the article about this. And he talks about this character of Diogenes as an example of what hypersanity would be. And so in psychology, generally, we tend to think that normality and the absence of tension and suffering, and is what mental health is. But some psychologists had a different opinion, and one of them is Neil Burton and his concept of the hypersane. And so in his opinion, people like even Jung, who we talked about in previous podcasts, who had vision when he was in his tower after he he parted with Freud and Diogenes. These people, they were crazy if we take common sense, the common sense meaning of the common meaning which is given to mental health. But these people, perhaps they were in a superior state of mental health, which looks like disease to the world, but which is not. And this would be similar to what Saint Paul said about and we already talked about this, the people who are the wisdom of the world is not the wisdom of God. So we have this character in Russian, in the Orthodox Christianity, of the fool for Christ, who is a saint who looks like a crazy person to the ordinary man, but who actually is in a state of hyper mental health. You can say
I mean,
this.
John the Baptist probably easily would have been put into a sanitarium, sanatorium or whatever, if he was around today. I've always enjoyed movies like that where like the hyper sane get put into like mental health institutions. I guess I relate. I guess I relate to it to some degree. Even when I was in high school, one of my favorite books and movies was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Have you ever seen that?
No, I haven't.
Well, yeah, it's a great movie that everybody should see, and it's very relevant to now. But Jack Nicholson's character fakes a mental illness to get out of prison. And he's put in a psych ward, and he realizes that a lot of the people there who are voluntarily committed, but they're kind of ruled over by totalitarian medical system, and it eventually causes an uprising amongst the idiots in the insane asylum. It's pretty great. There's another one that's a little bit like that. It's 12 Monkeys, where Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt. And Bruce Willis goes back in time and he's put into an insane asylum because he claims that he's a time traveler. And Brad Pitt's character, Jeffrey, speaks a lot of really difficult truths in there. It seems a thing that directors do is they put a lot of truth in the mouths of insane people, so that people don't take it too seriously. So I recommend both those movies. Both those movies are highly alchemical, and they're connected to one another. Have you seen 12 Monkeys?
No, I haven't. So it's good. I have new ideas
You should check it
of
out.
movies to watch.
Yeah, check it out. Check it out. And it's interesting. In 12 Monkeys, there's a virus outbreak, so they all have to go underground or whatever, and that's part of the reason why he's time traveling. Yeah, weird. So this, if this part about Ezekiel, I wanted to go into because it was very troubling to me. I then asked Ezekiel why he ate dung, and I was like, whoa, Ezekiel ate dung. This is weird. Like, what's going on here? So I had to go into it a little bit. I knew about the laying on his right and left side, knew in the prophesying, but this dung thing, um, I had to get this right. Uh, let's see here. Where do I want to talk? Um, so it comes from Ezekiel 4, 1 through 8. And the and this is some commentary that I am getting from Christianity.com, which is a pretty well respected site in the Christian world. The prophet was to represent the siege of Jerusalem by signs. He was to lie on his left side for a number of days, supposed to be equal to the years from the establishment of idolatry. All that the prophet sets before the children of his people about the destruction of Jerusalem is to show that sin is the provoking cause of the ruin of that once flourishing city. The bread, and this is from 4:9 through 17, the bread which was Ezekiel's support was to be made of coarse grain and pulse mixed together, seldom used except in times of urgent scarcity. And of this he was only to take a small quantity. Thus was figured the extremity to which the Jews were to be reduced during the siege and captivity. So, he apparently he does these things, but again, they are, if this interpretation is correct, and I looked into it, there are multiple interpretations of this, and just how much dung he ate, and how he made it, and how you make it with the bread. I mean, you could write a whole book about how Ezekiel ate bread and dung. There's a lot out there. But I think the general consensus is that, again, that he was trying to act something out or to foreshadow something to people. Not so much that he wanted to be some sort of ascetic shaman that raised people to the perception of the infinite, but to remind them of their sin. But maybe these things are connected in a way. I mean, maybe these things are connected in a way. I could see how you could connect them. Like the going naked, the living in austerity, the eating dung, to being less and less dependent on luxury and comforts of society, not sinning as much, and having the doors of perception blown open so that you can actually see the true God. You know, maybe that's what the opening the doors of perception is all about. And maybe it has to be an ascetic route to get to that. But at least with these biblical examples, they're signs and symbols of things to come. What do you think, Sophie?
Yes, I've read Jung saying that people were as saints. Some of them were using this asceticism, not using, but he thought that the asceticism was a factor in them having visions. And I think that's part of yes, we talked about shamans, and I think that's part of their culture, asceticism as a way of entering altered states of consciousness.
Well, perhaps that explains my life for the past 5 or 6 years. I've just been having a continuous vision as a result of my willfully induced asceticism. Sounds a lot better than what other people would say. So, do you want to say more about this passage, or should we move on to the next little bit?
Yes, I have more to say about the next one.
Okay. How about you read the end of this, and to the last word being cavern? The ancient
Yes.
Could you read those two paragraphs for us?
Yes, this part is very dense.
Yes.
The ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the
I didn't even know what I was doing when I asked you to read that. For those of you who haven't been following along, one of my favorite things in the world is to have Sophie say fire. Can you start again, Sophie? I'm sorry I laughed. Can you start from the top?
The ancient tradition that the world would be consumed in fire at the end of 6,000 years is true, as I have heard from hell. For the cherub, with his flaming sword, is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life. And when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas it now appears finite and corrupt. This will come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment. But first, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away, and displaying the infinite which was hid. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern.
All right, so it should go without saying for those of you who are interested that we have a direct connection to Aldous Huxley and the Doors of Perception. This is where he gets the title of his book, and also the band, The Doors. They got that from Aldous Huxley and from William Blake. Sophie, what would you like to say about the passage that you just read?
Can I read an extract from the book Blake Jung and the Collective Unconscious by June Singer about this paragraph?
Sure.
He says, he implies here that when reason ceases imposing its prohibitions upon man, man will be free to approach the tree of life. It is from that time forward that man will be able to distinguish what is finite and corrupt from what is infinite. Out of this, an improvement in sensual enjoyment will come to pass, for with man's greater knowledge derived from the tree of life, he will be able to enjoy the experiences of the senses on an entirely different level. That release from limitations of the body, man's material aspect, elevates the whole of mankind, is Blake's hypothesis. He found this corroborated by Isaiah and Ezekiel when he held his conversations with them. Here, then, is the task of the prophet or poet to melt apparent surfaces away and to cleanse the doors of perception. It is his task to use the word concretized into the printing process, which is literally the work of Blake's hands, to liberate man who has closed himself in the cavern of his own body and who sees only through the aperture of the five senses. In commenting on this section, Northrop Frye observes that all philosophies founded on sense experience are founded on a timid fear of expanding the powers of the mind, which uses the senses. So we we see here the tree of life, which I talked about in the introduction of this podcast when I talked about Paul Evdokimov book. And this seems to confirm what I was talking about, and that William Blake was trying um to find a way to reunite man, to find a new unity in the inner life of man. So he was searching for a way to reunite body and soul, and so the sensual enjoyment is not what we would immediately think about. It would rather be not only the five senses, the ordinary five senses, but also other senses which allows to see non-material realities. And the prophets and poets are their vocation is to help mankind to use these other senses, and as a consequence to leave their cave, like also Plato was talking about.
Yeah, I don't know enough about I mean, it all sounds very good. I just don't know enough about the personal lives of all the Jewish prophets to know if they were, um, if they completely mortified themselves. And I think that's an interesting thing that we have to look into. At least I mean, we get some sort of hint that this might be the case when Jesus tells us about not being attached to worldly possessions and how difficult it is for rich men to get into the kingdom of heaven. Uh, it's an interesting study. I don't know. Have you ever looked into the lives of all the prophets? I don't think I ever have. You know.
Yes, and actually I'm not sure that Blake is actually talking about uh, the biblical character and their historical characters.
That's true, right? Because he's engaging with them on another realm, right? Like
Yes,
he's not engaging,
I think he's using his imagination.
right? You're talking about him going into a celestial realm or tapping into them through, however they may have lived on the historical timeline is different from wherever they exist, where he's tapping into them via his imagination. If he is properly tapping into them when he's talking about communing with Isaiah and Ezekiel. What I thought the ancient tradition that the world will be consumed in fire at the end. I just want to point out that this isn't biblically unfounded. The Apostle Peter said, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare." So there's some grounding of this. What I thought was interesting, at the end of the 6,000 years, as I have heard from hell, and I just continue to find this interesting, and this isn't biblically unfounded either, how the devils know all this stuff. And it raises an interesting question about how did they know these things unless everything wasn't pre-planned, unless they had some access to it. Jesus tells us, or is it Jesus that tells us that the devil can quote scripture, or am I thinking of just a colloquial proverb? Or what Jesus does tell us is that I think one of the first beings to recognize Jesus as the Christ were demons that he encountered in an exorcism before any humans had acknowledged him as the Christ. The demons who had superior knowledge and foreknowledge they were like, "Oh no, is is it that time?" And Jesus commands these demons to say, "Shut up! Don't tell the people who I am yet. I've got to break it to them in my own way." Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
So it's interesting that there is, and we see this in the memorable fancy. There seems to be this whole like, at least how Blake imagines it, and how it's talked about in the Bible. There seems to be advanced knowledge that the devils and demons have, and I think it's an interesting question about why do they have it, and it's almost like this was all laid out in heaven in advance, and before they rebel, they might have been able to have some understanding of God's divine plan, which gets us back into a very deterministic model of things. But if they truly had that whole plan, why would they have rebelled and fallen and seduced mankind? It's so we get into a lot of interesting paradoxes.
Yes, and if we take the Jungian interpretation of it, and we equate hell with the unconscious, this takes another meaning, which would be that man has access to knowledge, which through the unconscious, that and especially the collective unconscious. So when we we can be inspired and have access to knowledge which we were not supposed to have.
Right. I mean, we are told that, I mean, we've given plenty of examples of just regular human beings that are given revelation. You know, Moses just encounters the burning bush, and Ezekiel is given end times prophecies. It seems like there is a secret plan or a meta knowledge that select individuals are able to tap into. And we're even told in the end times that that knowledge will increase, and that the old men will dream dreams and your young men will have visions.
Yes, it reminds me of something. Yeah. I don't know where it is, but
Yeah, it's Joel 2:28. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. So it seems like it's like given in pieces to select humans, Moses, Ezekiel, and then at some point it's going to be spread out amongst many, many individuals. This access to this higher knowledge.
yes, and I think the problem of discernment becomes very important when a lot of people think that they have revelations from other realms. It's important to be able to have this sense of discernment in order to discernment is the ability to sort what is true from what is false. And
right, and that's why I make such a big deal about bringing the Bible into this conversation, because if someone to ask, like, well, how do you know what's real and what's not real? Well, if you've got anything that's going against the Bible, I think that's a big red flag. Of course, it's it's a prophecy can be phrased in such a way where it seems like it's compatible. But I think it's a real clarion call that the reason why we have to study the Bible is so that we don't get tricked by false prophets. And we talked about that as well, that a false prophet is also someone who makes a conjecture and it doesn't come to pass too.
Yes, I'm not sure it's enough, because it depends how you understand the Bible.
Sure.
And
Sure.
and I think you can also be very have a great knowledge about the Bible and still do wrong things, like people during how do you say this in English? The Inquisition.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the most obvious example, right, too, is like when Satan tried to tempt Christ. He's like, well, throw yourself down. Won't the God send angels to catch you or something like that? Like Satan was trying to trap Jesus with scripture. And there are other episodes where they're trying, I believe, where the Pharisees try to trap Jesus with scripture. And he's like, no, that doesn't work. Doing like Neo Matrix moves. He's like, no, that won't work on me. But I think that it's important to realize here that Swedenborg, Blake, Jung, they're all bringing an interpretive lens to the Bible to begin with. So that's going to, affect how they make prophetic declarations, if they're making them at all.
Yes.
So. Yeah, you can know the Bible backwards and forwards, but if you have, I don't want to color it too negatively, but if you have an agenda, you can misconstrue it altogether. And I think it's really important also to pray for discernment and ask God to give you the wisdom not to be seduced by false doctrine.
And they have the same problem in Islam as well.
Oh, I don't doubt it. I'm sure every world religion has this problem.
Yes.
I'm sure these fights go on within Buddhism and Hinduism and Shintoism. It's just we're not as familiar with them.
Yes, and that it's very easy to get lost. Yeah. And it scares me. It scares me because I see so many people who think that they are being good people and who are full of hatred, and they do not realize it.
Well, I think that's a pretty obvious sign too. If someone's really filled with the Spirit of Jesus Christ, I don't think you're going to see hatred. I think that's a red flag also for whether or not someone has consumed an inappropriate ideology. Not that Jesus didn't have moments of anger, he certainly did, but it was reserved for very specific episodes, like when the temple was being delegitimized through commerce,
Yes, anger and hatred are not the same.
Right. I don't think I don't want to speak too much. I don't think Jesus ever expressed outright hatred of anyone, if memory serves me correctly. But at the same time, I think Jesus does hate sin. It seems like hate is reserved for sin, but not so much for people. People are given an opportunity to repent. That's why we have grace. God is very patient with us. Although that patience may have some limits, at some point that the opportunities to accept grace are kind of I think I don't want to speak for God. I think that may run out, but I think the whole point of Jesus coming to earth was to show mercy, and it bought humanity time to get right with God. So the whole idea of Jesus and hate seems that seems very problematic to me. I don't think those things go together.
Yes, I agree. I think it's the opposite. I think um I don't think he experienced hate because he was trying to uh, unite everything.
Well, we'll get Blake doesn't think so. We'll get if we get to the memorable fancy part today. He's got an interesting commentary that he makes about religion and Christ and unity and division and well.
Yes, and division as well. He brought also division, but not the hate division, another kind of division.
Well,
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this passage though about hating your.
Yes, yes, I agree. I know this one. Yes.
Yes.
This is interesting.
It is.
Yes, and but I think the word he used is the sword, and the sword does not mean hate because the sword also has a symbolic meaning.
Well, we got here. This is 1 John 4:20. If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother, whom he hath seen, how can he love God, whom he hath not seen? So we have Jesus talking against hate there. I think hate is, there might be.
Yes, but there is this passage about how he was bringing the sword.
Right.
Right. And people interpret it as he's bringing division amongst people, which he said as well, but the sword has another meaning as well.
Matthew 10:34. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword.
Yes. Yeah. And the woman I talked about, Annick de Souzenel, she talks about this passage a lot because she thinks the sword means the name of God.
Well, it's interesting. Sword is an anagram of words.
Yes.
Sword words. That'd be a good band name.
Yes, and so it would, the in Hebrew, the Jewish people, they do not say the name of words. They have God has a 4-letter name.
The Tetragrammaton, yes.
Yes, and this would correspond to the sword which Jesus is bringing in the world.
Interesting.
Going back, it has the shape of a sword. There is some representation of the tetragrammaton with the shape of a sword.
Ooh, and that is very interesting. Yeah, I'm seeing it here on swords. Also seeing it with pentagrams, which is concerning. That's a topic for another day. Yeah. Yeah, interesting stuff. Well, this line about, speaking of swords, for the cherub with his flaming sword is hereby commanded to leave his guard at the tree of life. And when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas it now appears finite and corrupt. This is interesting, right? Because Adam and Eve were cut off from the tree of life so that they wouldn't become immortal. And I guess kind of do as the serpent says. I don't want to be struck down by lightning here. I'm not trying to twist it. Like they would have become godlike in a way, but he's saying that it's this cherub that's standing in front of the tree of life that is actually making everything appear finite and corrupted. And when he leaves his guard, it's people won't have to eat of it. Like just the realities will merge again, and all of creation will seem infinite and holy. And this, what do I know? Maybe this is like actually the way that the mechanism of it works. I don't know if it is said. It seems like there's a lot of steps missing. You would have to prove that out, and I'm not in a position to do that. That's a very interesting interpretation about how we're going to return to paradise. I never heard it put quite like that, and I'm not sure if it's biblical. It could be. I think he's taking some liberties again there, but I thought that was an interesting way of saying it. And why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't there be a level of sensual enjoyment with it? I hate it because when you say sensual enjoyment, your mind kind of goes to like sex, but thinking about it differently. I mean, if the realms really did collide again, I mean, presumably food would taste better, water would be better, everything would be better. So there's that. Of course, there would be an enhancement of sensual enjoyment. But as far as sexual intercourse goes, I have no idea what's going to go on in the restoration of the creation. I don't know if I don't know if Adam and Eve were having sexual intercourse in the Garden of Eden prior to the fall.
I think I remember you had discussion about this with Robert Schert when you studied Kierkegaard.
We could have. I've read and talked about so many things. Like, thankfully,
I think it was the philosophical fragments, because Kierkegaard is talking about the problem of the fall as well.
Right.
And I remember you had such a fascinating conversation with Robert Schert.
I don't even remember what I said, but wouldn't surprise me. Wouldn't surprise me. This whole thing about, Blake's really against this idea of the body being separate from the soul. I think this really gets into some deep theological stuff about how the spirit and the soul and the body and the mind all sort of interact in Christianity. And there are all these different schisms within Christianity about how all these things interact. That's why you have people who think that when we die, we don't go to heaven, that we are essentially, we soul sleep until the resurrection. So I'm not going to say that this view is entirely right or wrong. The totality of the passages, when I look at them, I still tend to think that there is a separateness of them, because, you had Adam formed, and then God had to breathe life into him, and then he became, an actual human being. So there does seem to be some sort of additional thing that's added on to the body from that episode alone. It seems to me. Now it's much more complicated, but I tend not to endorse this view that Blake has about how the body and the soul are the distinction between them is an illusion.
How I interpret it is that Blake is talking about this concept of objectivation, which Evdokimov and Berdiev talked about. And objectivation is this separation between subjectivity and objectivity, and the separation between subject and object. And I think that's what Blake named as soul and body. And that in his opinion, what I think he was criticizing knowledge which would objective knowledge, actually. And he thought that, and also the separation between the external world and the inner world. And I don't know if I read that in the paragraph which I read, but it seems to me that it's the yes, that Blake is saying that the material world, when we think of it as something which is outside from us, doesn't have any meaning. But when we experience the external world as a reflection of the inner world, then we it takes a new it becomes meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. I I want to we should tie that into the last lines of this passage, because and maybe it'll help us understand what makes it so meaningful. So, I mean, I just said initially, oh look, this is where Aldous Huxley and the Doors got their names for their books and their band. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks in his cavern. So I read The Doors of Perception again recently, and Heaven and Hell, which also Huxley gets from this, and he's talking about using like psychoactives to have a much more enhanced sensual experience. I believe Huxley even was taking like LSD when he died. And by the way, he died the same day as JFK and C.S. Lewis. It just strikes me as interesting. We're not exactly having, we're having these cultural figures who are not exactly like the most godly individuals, right? You're talking about people who have claimed to have broken through to the other side, but a lot of it is involved sex and drugs. And this seems to be the gospel that it's preaching in order to achieve a certain level of enlightenment. And you got to wonder if how Blake would have felt about that, him being the inspiration for that. And there were all, this is also coming from, this is the title of this section. I mean, this is,
Yes.
Yeah. What do you want to say about that?
Yes, I've heard Dabrowski, who was another psychologist, which I like even more than Jung. He talked about how people were, it was not good for everyone to use this kind of drugs, because people who are not sufficiently psychologically developed, or we can say, it would be a negative experience for them, but that this could be a positive experience for someone who is doing work on himself and who has already reached a certain level of development. And so the danger of people like Huxley saying that people should use this is that people who are not, who do not have who are not involved in work on themselves outside of it, it would be a dangerous advice to give them, because they would not be ready for it.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, I know a lot of people in my life who have tried to expand their consciousness this way, and it's not worked out so well for any of them. And it raises very interesting questions, right? Okay, if we're opening a door, you know, doors, it's not just about you going into a place. You can also let things in. You know, doors are two-way. So at least when I think when we experiment with pharmaceuticals, we have to really ask ourselves, what are we opening? What are we opening ourselves up to? I know a lot of people claim that there's some sort of spiritual ascendancy there, but in my observations personally, I do not see that result. So, although we have no intimation that, I mean, we do get a little bit above here, about pharmaceuticals. A body distinct from a soul to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. So he's talking about taking corrosives as a way to disintegrate the distinction between body and soul. And in hell, corrosives are medicine. Well, maybe that's how things work in hell. I'm not sure that's how things work on Earth. I find this interesting. We do have the connection of the doors of perception with pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, and we could also have a psychological interpretation of this, which would be that maybe mental illness, which would be the corrosive, could how can we say this, disintegrate a former psychological structure in order for a new one to be built.
Yeah. I could see that interpretation being valid as well. Sophie, let me ask you this. I think we're at a good stopping point. I think next time we could probably cover the entire memorable fancy, and we've been going for probably over an hour, maybe an hour 10, hour 15 minutes. Would that be okay with you if we broke here today and picked it up at the memorable fancy next time?
Yes. Next time will not be next week, because I will go on a vacation.
That's good. But maybe in 2 weeks?
I think it will be rather 3 weeks.
Okay.
We will talk about this together.
Okay. Well, that'll give me some more time because to be honest, I'm just barely ahead. I did a memorable fancy, but it'll give me time to do the rest of the poem. So it'll give me time to catch up on that.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Well, I want to thank Sophie. Do you want to say anything in closing? Is there anything you didn't get to say today that you'd like to say?
No, I think I've said what I wanted to say.
Good. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening to us today. Sophie, thank you again for joining me on Saturday morning. I love how this has become part of my week. And we get to talk so often now about something we both enjoy. And I hope the listeners have enjoyed going on this ride with us.
Me too.
All right. All right. Take care, Sophie. I'll talk to you soon.
Yes. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye bye.